This is Rachel Cantor coming to you from the Mississippi First Office to explain part of the EdBuild MAEP conversation that has been going on in the news for the last several days, particularly about the 27% rule. What is the 27% rule? Why should we care? And why are people saying that if we eliminate the 27% rule, people might have to pay more in property taxes? Is that true? So let's start with some basics. First, we have a formula in Mississippi called MAEP that is under consideration to be rewritten, and EdBuild, which is the organization that was hired to examine the formula, has made a recommendation for how to rewrite that formula. Basically, what both MAEP and EdBuild determine are an amount of money that is the guaranteed state amount of money that every school district will have in order to spend on students. So the formula determines the state guarantee, whether it's MAEP or EdBuild or any other state's formula. It's going to determine that overall state guaranteed amount of money. Then once you determine that overall state guarantee amount of money, you have to decide who is going to pay for this amount. Typically, the state will pay some and the locals will pay some. And so the conversation is, how much should the state pay and how much should the locals pay? Under MAEP, we have two ways of determining how much the locals pay. The local share of the state guarantee that is determined by the formula. So MAEP says that the locals either have to pay the value of 28 mills, and a mill is a tax rate. It's basically taxing you at $1 for every $1,000 in property value. So 28 mills would be for every $1,000 of property you own, you have to pay $28. So 28 mills, or 27% of the total state guarantee, whichever of these is less. This is how MAEP works. EdBuild has said one of its recommendations is that we eliminate this 27% rule and we only look at the value of 28 mills for the local share. So what impact does that really have of taking away that 27% rule? Who is the 27% rule currently benefiting right now? Because not every school district benefits from the 27% rule. So that's what we're going to explain. So let's look at three different school districts. And I picked these school districts because they have a similar enrollment. And of the students in that enrollment, they have pretty similar needs. Slightly different in each one, but fairly similar. So Pascagoula-Gaucher has 7,098 students, Lee County has 7,083, and Tupelo has 6,905, all about 7,000 students. And if you take into consideration the needs of all these students, you end up with a state guarantee that's pretty similar. So 45.2 million, 44.7 million, and 44 million for Tupelo. So all within about $1 million of each other, and about the same number of students, similar needs. So this is what the state guarantee is under the formula. But in reality, each of these three school districts has a radically different amount of money at its disposal to spend on students in state and local dollars. So Pascagoula-Gaucher actually has about $79 million in state and local money to spend on students. Lee County only has about $50.4 million to spend on students, and Tupelo only has $59 million. So how is it that three school districts with the same size of population and similar student needs have such different amounts of money to spend on students? And that's where we start getting into the conversation about 28 mills versus 27%. So let's come over here and look at how we would calculate the local share versus the state share. So here are our three school districts again: Pascagoula-Gaucher, Lee County, and Tupelo. And here's our state guarantee. Again, it's the same: 45.2 million, 44.7 million, and about 44 million. So the state says you have to tax yourselves at least 28 mills. And again, a mill is $1 for every $1,000 in value. So 28 mills is about $28 for every $1,000 in value. And these mills only apply to schools. So when you have this tax rate, it only goes to support the schools. So for each of these 3 different school districts, even though this 28 mil tax rate is the same, they're going to be each raising a very different amount of money because some of the school districts are more property wealthy than others. So Pascagoula-Gaucher for 28 mills raises $27.6 million, but Lee County only raises $6.8 million. And Tupelo's kind of in the middle at $13.8 million. Now, one of the ideas behind MAEP was that regardless of where in the state a child lives, the child should be given an adequate amount of money to finance their education. So they should be guaranteed in that state guarantee a similar amount of money as somebody in another school district that maybe has more property wealth. And so that's where this 28 mills comes in, because even though so they're going to make the tax rate the same, and what they're going to do is even though each of these school districts has a local ability to pay that's very different, the state is going to guarantee the same amount, which means the state is going to give a different amount of money to each of these 3 school districts to make sure that the overall amount is the same. So if our overall amount is here in orange the same, and we subtract from it the amount the locals are able to pay, we're going to get a very different amount of money that the state is paying. So in Pascagoula-Gaucher, which is the richest of these 3 school districts, they're going to get the least from the state, $17.6 million. Lee County, which is the poorest of these 3 school districts, is going to get $37.9 million, and Tupelo is going to get about $30 million. So, how much money do each of these 3 school districts have to spend overall? Well, the reality is that nobody is actually taxing themselves at only 28 mills. Every school district in this state, except for one, is above 28 mills. Pascagoula-Gaucher is taxing itself at 46.88 right now. Lee County's at 51.17 and Tupelo's at 55, which means that in terms of the overall amount of money that these 3 school districts have to spend, we're going to add together what they would get from the state to everything they can raise locally. So these 3 school districts have different tax rates, and they have different property wealth. So each of these 3 districts is going to be able to raise a very different amount of money locally. So in Pascagoula-Gaucher, which is taxing itself the least of these 3 school districts, they're actually going to still raise the most. They're going to raise $46 million. In Lee County, which is at 51.17 in millage, they're actually going to raise the least because they're the property poorest district out of these 3. They're only going to raise $12.4 million, even though they're taxing themselves at a higher rate than Pascagoula-Gaucher. And then Tupelo is actually taxing itself at the highest of these 3. They're going to raise about in the middle, $27.1 million. And so when we add these local amounts together with the state share, we get an overall amount of money for each of these 3 school districts in black that is different. Pascagoula-Gaucher, because it's getting so much money from the locals, even though it has the smallest state share, is still going to come out well ahead of any of the other districts. They're going to get $63.9 million in total. Lee County, which is the property poorest of the 3 districts, even though they're getting the most money from the state, they still have less money to spend overall at $50.4 million. And Tupelo, which is kind of in the middle, ends up kind of in the middle at $57.3 million. Now this is how it would work if we just had the 28 mil rule. But that's actually not how it works, because there's an added little rule called the 27% rule that changes how much money these 3 districts have. So if we look at, go back to our first graph, okay? So these 3 amounts is how much they would have if you include the 27% rule. You can see that for Pascagoula-Gaucher and Tupelo, they end up with a lot more money than they had without the 27% rule. So how does that work? So this is basically what the 27% rule means. So let's start with 28 mills, because the rule says 28 mills or 27%, whichever is less, is what the local pays. So 28 mills for Pascagoula is going to be about, like I said, it's $27.6 million, which is about half the cost of the state guarantee. For Lee County, 28 mills is only $6.8 million. So that's very little towards the state guarantee. And then for Tupelo, 28 mills is $13.8 million, which is about a third of the state guarantee. That's what it would be. That's what everybody would be getting from the state if there were no 27% rule. But because of the 27% rule, the state says we will never make you locals pay more than 27% of the total cost, which means that if you are able to raise through 28 mills more than 27%, you get to keep the difference. So for Pascagoula-Gaucher, 27% of $45.2 million is about $12.2 million. So instead of Pascagoula-Gaucher having to pay half the cost, they're now only going to pay about a third of the cost. And the state is going to pay all of the difference. For Lee County, because the amount that they're able to raise through 28 mills is less than 27%, they don't get any extra. They just get the same amount that the state was always paying. And then for Tupelo, where we have 28 mills is about 13.8, but 27% is only about 11.9, they also get about a $2 million bonus from the state that they don't have to pay, that the state is going to pay. So basically, for these property wealthy districts, the state is making up the difference between 28 mills and 27%. So instead of this state formula equalizing the amount of resources, the state is actually giving more money to property wealthy districts, which means the overall total is going to be different, because now instead of Pascagoula-Gaucher paying $27.6 million and then all of the rest of their local property taxes on top of that and ending up at $63.9 million, they're going to get the benefit of this extra $15 million that the state is now going to give them, which means it's going to push their total all the way up to $79.3 million. So now we've widened the gap between Lee County, which doesn't get a bonus, from $50 million to 63.9, which is about 14 million, all the way from $50 million to 79 million, which is almost a $30 million difference. People who are in Pascagoula-Gaucher's situation are very nervous about EdBuild's recommendation, because EdBuild has said you, Pascagoula-Gaucher, should not be getting this extra bonus from the state when you can afford to pay the full value of 28 mills. And so under EdBuild's recommendation, they would go from having to pay the full value, or from only having to pay 27% to having to pay the full value, which changes the overall amount of money for them. They still end up ahead. They're still raising overall a lot more money than these other school districts, but not as much more money as they had before. And Pascagoula-Gaucher has said that's not fair. That's not fair for you to take away that money from me. In order for Pascagoula-Gaucher to keep that $79 million, they would have to raise taxes. The other thing they could do is they could cut their budget so that they wouldn't have to raise taxes back down to this $63.9 million. But Pascagoula-Gaucher and other school districts like that have said, this is not fair for you to take away our bonus. But here's the question. What is more unfair? Is it unfair to ask Pascagoula-Gaucher to give up the state bonus that they get? Or is it unfair to ask Lee County, which doesn't have the resources in its community and doesn't get any special state bonus, to not get any more money because instead it's going to property wealthy districts. And that's what the conversation about the 27% rule elimination is about, because these school districts that are currently benefiting from it don't want to give it up, even though most school districts don't get that benefit.